Welcome to the Westport Library. Today's program will begin momentarily. Supported by Verso Studios, created locally and shared with the world.
Welcome, and thank you for coming today. I'm Topsy Sideroff, program coach. Okay, can you hear me? Yes. Program co-chair of the Westport Garden Club. If anyone in the audience is interested in joining, please let us know. We'd be happy to tell you more about our club and how much we all enjoy being members. It is my honor to introduce Doug Tallamy, a leading and most respected voice in the gardening world, and I think way beyond the gardening world. Dr. Tallamy is a professor of entomology at the University of Delaware. He's also the author of several groundbreaking books, among them, Bringing Nature Home, How You Can Sustain Wildlife with Native Plants, The Nature of Oaks, The Rich Ecology of Our Most Essential Native Trees, and Nature's Best Hope, a new approach to conservation that starts in your yard. All get a 5-star rating on Amazon, where they can be purchased. However, the library has his complete works, and you can borrow one on your way out. The lecture today is based on Nature's Best Hope. Thank you to the Westport Library for partnering with the Westport Garden Club on this program. And special thanks to Jennifer Keller, the library's programming and events coordinator, for facilitating the arrangements. And you can see that there's a microphone back there, and Jennifer will guide you because there will be a chance at the end of Dr. Tallamy's presentation for you to ask him questions. The words best and hope are appealing in our challenged world. No doubt, Dr. Tallamy's talk is filled with both. Dr. Tallamy.
Okay, yes, thanks. I do want to talk about what my idea of nature's best hope is. And I will give you a spoiler. You are nature's best hope. And I'm going to tell you why I think so. But before I do that, let's talk about what E.O. Wilson's idea of nature's best hope was. He, of course, was a professor at Harvard for many decades, one of the most distinguished scientists of our time, probably of all times. And one of the things that was consistent throughout his career, his very long career, was that he loved life on Earth. He loved biodiversity. And he spent most of his career trying to save it, not just because he loved it, but because he knew it was essential to our own well-being. Of course, Dr. Wilson died the day after Christmas last year, so it's a terrible loss to conservation. But in 2016, he wrote this book, Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life. And he had one simple message. He said, if we're going to save life anywhere on planet Earth, we have to save nature. We have to save functioning ecosystems on at least half of planet Earth. And he spent most of the book talking about the science that supports that statement. And then he ended the book. He didn't spend a lot of time telling us how we were going to save life on half of planet Earth. Of course, to a conservation biologist, that sounds like a wonderful idea. We'll just put half the Earth aside and everything will be great. Problem is, of course, is that half of planet Earth, half of terrestrial Earth, is already in some form of agriculture. And now we have 8 billion people with all of our houses and roads and detritus and airports and the other half. And we don't have a third half to put aside for nature. So how can we actually do this? Well, that's what I want to talk about today. I do think we can realize E.O. Wilson's dream, but in order to do that, we need a new approach to conservation. Before we talk about that, though, let's talk about what happened in 2019 We had a very large oak mast in the red oak group. Members of the red oak group got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time. And this is what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I'm easily entertained. So I took one of those acorns and I just stared at it. And I was rewarded because an insect started to chew its way out of the acorn. First, it chewed a little hole for its head, then it forced its head through there. Then it tried to force its entire body through there. It was a tight squeeze, finally made it. And once this insect is outside the acorn, it's a very dangerous time because a lot of things want to eat it. So it gets to safety by wiggling and squirming beneath the soil surface. It takes about 30 seconds. And once it's underground, it stretches in all directions and forms a chamber. And within that chamber, converts itself to a pupa, and then surprisingly stays underground in that chamber as a pupa for 2 years. After 2 years, comes out as an acorn weevil. That's what an acorn weevil looks like. Looks like weevils have a big nose. A lot of people think they do, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule. And the mouth parts are way down here at the end of that extension. And they take those mouth parts and chew a hole into the center of the acorn, turn around and lay an egg in that hole. And that is how the larva gets into the acorn. Why do they spend 2 years underground? Why don't they come out the next year the way most insects would? Well, it takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development. So if they came out the next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. Of course, after they leave the acorn, it leaves a hole, which is kind of like a true vacuum. And you know that nature abhors a vacuum. And in this case, she has filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants, tiny little ants where the entire colony lives in the holes made by acorn weevils after they have left the acorn. And if scouts find a new hole in a new acorn, they get all excited because their old acorn is falling apart. So they tell everybody it's time to move. They grab the larvae, they grab the eggs, they move the entire colony into the new acorn. It takes about 30 minutes. Then they post a guard to make sure nobody else comes in. And this is where they'll live for the next 2 years until this acorn falls apart. What's my point with this little story? Well, that's just one of literally millions of very specialized interactions, largely between animals and plants that comprise the bulk of nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays and acorns. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns. They'll take an acorn and they'll fly up to a mile from the parent tree, tap it below the surface of the soil, and then, of course, the object is to go back in the wintertime and have something to eat. But for every 4 acorns they bury, they only remember where one is. So for every 4 acorns they bury, they've actually planted 3 oak trees. Specialized interaction between pileated woodpeckers and carpenter ants. That's what they rear their young on, carpenter ants. So you won't have pileated woodpeckers unless you have a lot of carpenter ants, and you won't have a lot of carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have Phacelia. That is the only plant, the only pollen that bee can rear its young on. And it turns out that pollen specialization is very common in our native bees. We have about 4,000 species of native bees in this country, and over a third of them can only reproduce on the pollen of particular plants. You won't have Baltimore checker spots unless you have white turtlehead. I could talk all day, all week, all year about nature's specialized relationships. The problem today, though, is that these relationships, nature itself, is now on the ropes. And it's on the ropes largely because we did not take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, looked out over the edge, and he said, leave it as it is. And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. Well, we didn't leave most of the country as it was. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 states. It's anything close to its original pristine ecological condition. And those are typically mountaintops. And that's because we have logged the country repeatedly. We have tilled it. We have drained it. We have grazed it. Got 770 million acres of rangeland in this country. That's 4.5 times the size of Texas dedicated to cattle. And of course, we've otherwise paved it or developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them, and you can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we've carved up those natural areas into tiny remnants of their former selves. And each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated to sustain the amount of nature that we need them to sustain us. So you might wonder why we've done that. I wonder why we've done that, and I don't know. But I suspect we thought that the Earth, our nest, was so large we could foul it forever, and there wouldn't be any consequences. But of course, we were wrong about that. And that's why we see headlines like this at a pretty regular clip these days. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one, North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. That's a third of our North American bird population already gone. Now the UN says we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction, probably in the next 20 years. And they said it 2 years ago. So now that's next 18 years. Makes a nice headline, but it is not an option, folks. These are the species that run the ecosystems that support us. We have to make sure this doesn't happen. So I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, this upon all of our houses. That's not what this talk is about. This talk is about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from lots of people like you and me, but those efforts will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return briefly to this headline. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, back to E.O. Wilson. He told us what it would mean if Earth lost its insects, and he did it way back in 1987 with this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. And again, his message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappeared, that would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystems that the food webs that support our animals, the amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, the mammals, those food webs would collapse and those animals would all disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers, and all we would have is bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. There is some good news, and that is that none of that has to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape in order to do it. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are products of nature. We are totally dependent on the life support that ecosystems provide. We call them ecosystem services. Here are just a few things that plants do that we depend on every day, like produce oxygen, like clean our water, slow its journey to the sea where it becomes too salty to use, carbon capture, enormously important today. Plants are pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, out of harm's way, building their tissues out of that carbon, and then pumping extra carbon into the ground through their root systems. And once it's in the ground, it's extremely stable, can remain there for thousands of years. Plants build topsoil, hold it in place. They prevent floods. They dampen severe weather. They convert sunlight into food. If we lose our plants, we're going to have to eat sunlight. That'll be a challenge. What do animals do for plants? Well, lots of things, but these are important ones. They provide pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds. So designing landscapes like this that destroy the production of ecosystem services is just not a good idea. Never was a good idea, but today it's a terrible idea because of those 8 billion people demanding more and more ecosystem services every single day. Now, we do have parks and we do have preserves. They're doing the best they can, but it's not good enough. And that's why we are now in the 6th great extinction event that the planet has ever experienced, which means we have to start practicing conservation outside of parks and preserves, on landscapes just like this. There have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth. And Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. He wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. One of the things he said is that the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. Now, there have been indigenous groups who have been good at doing that for long periods, but our huge Western societies and our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the earth than it has to offer, completely wrecking an area, going to another area, doing the same thing, not sustainable behavior. But Aldo Leopold had a lot of faith in humans. He believed that we were capable of developing what he called a land ethic. He knew we had to use the land. We had to farm and lumber and graze and mine and do all of those things. But he believed we could learn to do those things gently enough that we did not destroy local ecosystems. That's what he called a land ethic, and he wrote about it in the Sand County Almanac. What he did not write about was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect that the notion that humans and nature cannot live together, cannot be in the same place at the same time, they cannot coexist, that notion was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day. It's still embedded in our own culture, that he may not have recognized it as an option. Well, what I want to argue today is that not only is living with nature an option, it's now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. Now we have to turn that on its head and practice conservation where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. In other words, we've got to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, not hang on by a thread, not get diminished every year, but thrive. Where should we start? Well, back to private property. We can't ignore conservation on private property because most of the land is privately owned. 78% of the entire country is privately owned. 85.6% of the US east of the Mississippi is privately owned. If we don't practice conservation on private property, we're going to fail. Now, when I use the word conservation, I'm not using it correctly. We do want to conserve any bits of nature that are left, absolutely. That has been our conservation model for the last century. But it's not good enough now. We've got to go beyond that and restore nature in areas where we've destroyed her. In other words, we have to practice restoration. And before you tell me, well, there's no way you're going to put it back together again exactly the way it was before we destroyed it. I know that. But we can reunite enough of those specialized interactions to create functional ecosystems once again, even if it's not exactly what was on that space at some point in the past. But in order to do that, we have to start with the building blocks. Not all species contribute to ecosystem function equally. So we have to start with the most powerful groups. And there's two groups we can't do without. One is the flowering plants, and of course, those pollinators that allow those plants to reproduce. They are capturing energy from the sun, turning it into food through photosynthesis. And that, of course, is the food that supports just about all the animals on the planet. And they're storing that food in their plant parts, mostly their leaves. Well, it turns out that if we don't get that food to animals, you don't have any animals. And most vertebrates don't eat plants directly. Most vertebrates eat invertebrates that eat plants. Most of the invertebrates are insects, and not just any insect. It turns out that caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So if we design landscapes that don't have enough caterpillars in them, we're going to have failed food webs and eventually failed ecosystems. I'm going to use the Carolina chickadee as an example. That's the species of chickadee that is in southeast Pennsylvania where I live. But there's all the species. You've got black-capped chickadee. All the species of chickadees are doing pretty much the same thing. They come to our feeders, they eat seeds, and we tend to think that that's all chickadees need. Well, even in the wintertime, only 50% of their diet is seeds. The other 50% is insects and spiders. And when they are reproducing, their babies can't eat seeds at all. So they switch entirely to invertebrates. And if they're in a healthy environment, they will rear their young exclusively on caterpillars. And they are not exceptions. 96% of our terrestrial birds rear their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. How do I know that? Well, there's a number of lines of evidence that suggest that, but this is a citizen science project that one of my grad students, Ashley Kennedy, did a few years ago. She put out a call to bird photographers across the country and said, please take pictures of birds during the breeding season when they are carrying food to the nest. Send those pictures to me. I will identify them. I'll identify the prey items that are in the beaks of those birds and reconstruct the nestling diet for as many species of birds in the US as I can. So it was very successful. She got thousands of pictures, did a lot of identifying. You're looking at a summary of her results. And the green bars are the percentage of the nestling diets in the 20 most common bird families that were caterpillars. And in 16 out of those 20 common bird families, caterpillars dominated the diet. So again, what would happen to our breeding birds if we didn't have enough caterpillars? Most of them would not be able to breed at all. Something special about caterpillars. What is it? There's actually several things special about caterpillars. One of them is that they're soft. Think of this guy as if he's a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. Thin wrapper is its exoskeleton. It's made of chitin. It's undigestible. And because caterpillars are soft, you can stuff them down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring them. And if you've ever watched a parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. The beak is like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Now, some of our smaller birds do chase aphids around. Here's one chasing aphids. But you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar. They're nutritious. They're high in fat. They're high in protein, low percentage of chitin, of exoskeleton compared to many other types of insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages, they're like little tanks. So much of a beetle is undigestible, and a lot of beetles have very sharp edges too. And then finally, it turns out that caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. Now, I mentioned carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate, and you're a vertebrate, and birds are vertebrates, and we vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. Only plants make carotenoids. So we have to get our carotenoids from plants, and we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of vertebrate diets. Where the birds getting their carotenoids from during the breeding season? From what they eat, of course. But look, carotenoid content is not equally distributed among bird prey items. These first two bars here are types of caterpillars. They have far more carotenoids than other types of bird prey. Here, the adult caterpillars down here, the moths and butterflies themselves, they have far fewer carotenoids because they're not eating the green leaves. The carotenoids are in the green leaves, and that's what the caterpillars are eating. And here's the earthworm down here. So the other bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. So that study and several others are suggesting the caterpillars are not optional parts of bird diets. It's really looking like they're essential parts of most bird diets. So let's just say most birds need caterpillars. The next question is, how many do they need? Is one or two enough? Or one or two a day enough? Good question. So let's go back to chickadees. There are a lot of data on chickadees. How many caterpillars does it take to make a nest of chickadees? One or two is not enough. One or two a day is not enough. It takes thousands, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars, depending on the number of chicks in the nest, to get one nest to the point where they leave the nest, where they fledge. And after they leave the nest, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 21 days, but they're flying all around, so nobody's been able to count that. But you're talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars required to get one clutch of a bird that's a third of an ounce through to maturity. That's 4 pennies worth of bird. And if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, you need all those caterpillars in your yard. They only forage about 50 meters from the nest. And that's true for most birds. They're foraging very close to the nest. They are not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. And if we landscape in a way that does not include all of those insects, that's called insect decline. And it's really looking like insect decline is one of the major causes of the bird declines that we're measuring. We went to the original data set of Rosenberg et al. There's the Smithsonian group that said we've lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. And we divided the terrestrial bird species into 2 groups. The species that require insects at some point in their life history, typically when they're breeding, and the species that don't need insects. So things like finches and doves can actually reproduce on a milk that they make out of seeds, and they don't require insects. And look, they didn't lose any numbers at all. But the species that require insects lost on average 10 million individuals per species. It does not prove cause and effect, but it certainly does suggest that as you take away bird food, you lose the birds. So we need to raise the bar about what we've been asking our landscapes to do. In the past, we've asked them to be pretty, and that's good. We can keep doing that. But now they have to be pretty and ecologically functional. And there's no way they're going to be ecologically functional unless we add caterpillars to those landscapes. So how do we add caterpillars to residential landscapes? We do that by adding the plants that support those caterpillars. And that seems easy enough, but there is a catch, and that is that most plants do not support a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be fussy about it. We have to be fussy about which plants we choose, and we have to be fussy about it because the caterpillars themselves are fussy about it. And the monarch butterfly illustrates that perfectly. You can have all the crepe myrtle and all the calorie pear and all the burning bush and all the barberry and all of the Asian plants that we typically landscape with in our yards, and you won't support a single monarch butterfly. The only thing that's going to create a monarch butterfly is one of the milkweeds. That's called host plant specialization. And it turns out that most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. They can only eat particular plants. Why is that? Well, plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their leaves with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really effective defense. It keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And that's why it's green out there in the wintertime. I mean, in the summertime. It's not because there's no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well protected. There's a reason it's hard to get our kids to eat their vegetables. They inherently know that they're toxic. But we do know that insects eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. They can only eat the plants for which they have developed very specialized adaptations that allow them to circumvent the plant defenses. Specialized enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize the insect's exposure to those compounds. It takes a long period of evolutionary history with those plant lineages for all those adaptations to fall into place. And once they do, the insect's locked into eating that particular plant. So if you take the milkweeds out of your yard and replace them with hostas, the monarch's not going to be able to develop on hostas. It's locked into milkweeds, which means you've given the monarch two choices: fly away and find milkweeds someplace else if they can, or starve to death. It turns out this is actually very simple. There are three kinds of plants out there: plants that contribute energy to local food webs, plants that do not contribute energy to local food webs, and plants that actively remove energy from local food webs. The best contributor across the country is one of our oaks. They're contributing more energy to local food webs than any other type of plant. Good example of a non-contributor would be a ginkgo biloba from Asia. Nice ornamental tree, good fall color, but nothing eats a ginkgo. So it's not contributing any energy to local food webs. And a good example of a detractor would be any of our invasive ornamentals, things like calorie pear, which not only don't support many insects, but they escape and replace the native plants that do support those insects. So they're removing energy from local food webs. All I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters. If we're going to rebuild the food webs that support the ecosystems during our big restorations, we got to choose the right plants or it's not going to work. And I'm going to give you three examples of how well it does work when we do choose the right plants, starting with my house right here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. So where my wife Cindy and I moved in the year 2000. We got a piece of a farm that was broken up into 10-acre lots. Burial farm, been farmed for almost 300 years. Soil was exhausted. The last thing they did was mow it for hay. So there was very little there. So we wanted to restore the local ecosystem. And I knew that you had to put caterpillars back, but I'd never done it before. So I started out with this species, the Canadian owlet. People say, why'd you choose the Canadian owlet? Well, I looked through Dave Wagner's Caterpillars of Eastern North America, and I said, that's a pretty one. Let's do that. That's what the adult looks like, just like a leaf. Well, you're not going to have Canadian owlets unless you have their host plant, which is meadow rue. They are host plant specialists, just like monarchs are. And we didn't have any meadow rue. There was meadow rue hundreds of years ago, but the area had been farmed to death for a very long time. So we got some meadow rue seeds from someplace, planted them. They grew very nicely, but this was early on, and I actually had very little faith that Canadian owlets would be able to find my little patch of meadow rue, so I didn't even go out and check it for at least 2 months after I planted it. Then I was walking by for another reason, and I looked over, it was covered with Canadian owlets. They had found it right away. I'm still impressed with that. So now we have a good population of meadow rue and Canadian owlets. We've added 2 species to the property. The restoration has begun. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. That's a misnomer. This beautiful moth has nothing to do with goldenrod. It's a specialist on this plant, Biden's aristosa. Ditch daisy. We didn't have any Biden's aristosa, but there were, in a power line cut about 14 miles away, there was a patch of Biden. So I got some seeds. I planted them at home. They grew very nicely. As a matter of fact, this summer, they took over in my front yard. That's okay. Well, I had to wait a year before the goldenrod stowaway found my Bidens, but they finally did. And now we have a good population of both of those. So now I've added 4 species to the property. Wanted to see if I get the hackberry emperor breeding at our house. Not because it's the most beautiful butterfly in the world, but because it belongs there. It's one of the species that should be on our property. But as its name suggests, it's a specialist on hackberry, on Celtis. We didn't have any hackberry. So I got some hackberry trees, planted them. Took 4 years for the hackberry emperor to find my hackberry trees, but they did. And now I have a good population of those. So now we've added 6 species to the property. And that is how the restoration proceeded. I did not plant goldenrod. It came in on its own. And along with it came many of the things that specialize on goldenrod, like the beautiful brown hooded owlet, the Arcidra flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. This is one that hasn't come yet, the goldenrod flower moth. I don't know why it hasn't found my goldenrod, but it hasn't. That's what the caterpillars look like. It's still part of the fun, though. This is anticipation. It's like waiting for the ketchup to come out of the bottle. Every year I go out and I check my goldenrod looking for these caterpillars. One of these years I'm going to find it, and it will be a great year. Planted Virginia creeper. Yes, Virginia creeper. I hear some people don't like Virginia creeper. I just don't know why. It's a great native plant. It's got good fall color. It's a good ground cover. It can climb our trees without girdling them, without pulling them down. Makes valuable nutritious berries for the birds in the fall. And by nutritious berries, I mean high in fat. That's what birds need in the fall to support their migration. Remember, fat has twice the energy that sugar has in it. And these berries are produced by tiny little inconspicuous flowers. You don't even know Virginia creepers in bloom until you see this big cloud of native bees around it. It's a wonderful pollinator plant. Remember, when you're making a pollinator garden, you're making it for the pollinators. If the flowers aren't big and showy for you, that's okay. I planted Virginia creeper because it's one of the best host plants to make the large sphinx moth caterpillars that are a primary component of cardinal diets. Things like Pandora sphinx, and its beautiful adult, the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. I want to see if I get the double-toothed prominent at our house, just because it's such a cool looking caterpillar. It looks like a stegosaurus. Even if you don't like caterpillars, you've got to like this guy. Well, it's a specialist on elm, primarily American elm. And of course, we didn't have any American elm. We lost that decades ago to the Dutch elm disease. But there are two big American elms at the University of Delaware that did not die. Every year they make a lot of seed. So shortly after we moved in, I gathered up some of that seed from the gutter and planted them at home. They germinate in 6 days, grow very quickly. Today, those trees, it's 21 years later, those trees are 80 feet tall. And they did bring in the double-toothed prominent, another big success, American elm. Evening primrose moth. I wanted the evening primrose moth because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. But believe it or not, we didn't have any evening primrose, so I planted that. The moth came, spends the day with its head stuffed in the flowers. Sometimes it's crowded in there, but they're always very cute. And I planted lots of oaks. Now, those are just examples of the plants that I put back, but I want to focus on oaks for a while because they are such important plants. This is the Bedford oak at Bedford, New York, Martha Stewart land. Some of you might know this tree. It's enormous. People argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. And I hear people say, I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. And if you can only enjoy your oak when it's 400 years old, you're right, you won't. But if you can enjoy what your oak is contributing to your local food web, a new landscape goal, remember, you can enjoy it right away. And I can say that with confidence because I planted most of my oaks as acorns, which means they were free, or 2-foot bare root whips, which means they cost $1.50 each. And immediately they started to attract the moths that created the caterpillars that run the food web at my house. Things like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenile's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, Suzuki's promolactus, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm, the hesitant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crown bucolatrix, the orange patch smoky wing, the white blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red line panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of caterpillars have come to the oaks on my property, and they come right away. This is a pin oak that's just popped its head above the leaves, and here is a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves of that tree. You do not have to wait decades or hundreds of years for your oak to start to support the local food web. They will do it immediately. This is what our yard looks like in a typical summer these days. That's where the Bidens colonized this past summer. Just to show you, we put a lot of plants back. And not all of them, still working on it, but through the years, my research has shown that caterpillars are really important components of local food webs. And if you know the number of species of caterpillars in your food web, you have a very good index of how productive that food web is and how stable it is. So 5 years ago, I took on the challenge of trying to take a picture of every species of moth that is now making a living at our house. I am still at it, but I'm up to 1,199 species of moths that I photographed at our house. And we have 10 acres. Pennsylvania is 2.4 million acres. So on 1/240,000th of the landmass, we have supported 44% of all the moths that occur in the entire state. And because so many of these species are types of bird food, we've recorded 60 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres. Not flew by, but bred. Why am I telling you this? Well, this is another scary headline that we see pretty regularly. World Wildlife Fund says that 2/3 of Earth's wildlife had vanished since 1970. That's a terrible statistic. But I'm thinking, gee, not at our house. I'm convinced we have increased biodiversity by more than 2/3. It didn't take that long and it wasn't that hard. We just put the plants back. What would happen if everybody put the plants back? We could turn things like this around. But I know what you're thinking. We have 10 acres. A lot of people have less land than that. Will it work on smaller properties in, say, suburbia? Very good question. So let's go to Margie and Dan Terpstra's house in Kirkwood, Missouri, where they live in suburbia. They got 0.6 acres, 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. They're in the middle of a development. All their neighbors have the big yards. When they moved in, their yard was choked with Amur honeysuckle, bush honeysuckle, major invasive species, particularly in the Midwest. So the first thing they did was get rid of that. Then they planted 70 species of native plants, put in a water feature they call a bubbler, and then they sat back and started to count the birds that are using their yard. And they are up to 149 bird species, including 35 warbler species. And if any of you are birders, you know that is it's an amazing number. Just to put that in perspective, Cindy and I have only recorded 8 warbler species at our house. So does it work on smaller properties? Absolutely. What about urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago, right over there is O'Hare Airport. Pam has 1/10 of an acre, 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. She is not connected to any natural area at all. So she's a little island in the middle of Chicago. She's a pretty island because Pam is a very talented native plant landscaper. But she did the same thing. She got rid of her non-native plants, put in 60 species of native plants, added a water feature, and then she sat back and she says, with a glass of wine, and counted the birds that are using her yard. And she's up to 124 species that have used her yard, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, go to Pam's house in Chicago. Okay, 4 things we need to think about if we're going to succeed in a big way. And we need to succeed in a big way. And one of them is we've got to reduce the area that is in lawn. As of 2005, we had 40 million acres of lawn nationwide. It's now around 44 million acres. That's an area bigger than the size of New England, dedicated to an ecological deadscape. And we know why we do this. Lawn is a status symbol, and we have to support our Halloween decorations. But what if we cut the area of lawn in half? What if we replanted half the area in productive plants? Now, notice I'm not saying get rid of lawn, just we're going to cut the area in half. What if we take places like this and turn it into this? I got this picture from Dan Getman not too long ago. He lives in Missouri, and he had this big lawn, and he said, look, I'm doing it, I'm putting back the plants, and he sent me this picture. Well, let's make the math simple. Let's say we've got 40 million acres. We cut that in half. That would give us 20 million acres that we could build a new national park with. If we do it at home, let's call it Homegrown National Park. And it'll be big. It'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park would be the biggest park in the country. What do we get when we put a park at home? We get the opportunity to build a personal relationship with Mother Nature, with the living things around us. Maybe we're going to rekindle a relationship we had as a child but have lost. Maybe we're going to develop it for the first time. But we get to do it at our own timing, our own pace. All we have to do is go outside, or maybe even just look out our window. We can avoid crowds. You know, if you go to a real national park, last year, 375 million people there alongside of you. So not sure how much nature you're going to see. It's free. There's no admission fee. It's never closed, no matter what pandemic comes down the pike. You can avoid travel hassles. You get to experience the natural world alone, which I think is essential to developing that personal relationship, not mediated by somebody else. And it's particularly important for our poor kids. who are suffering from nature deficit disorder, according to Richard Louv. So we're trying. We get 30 kids. We put them on a bus with a teacher. And they drive for an hour, get to a natural areas, and they walk around for an hour, and the teacher tells them not to touch anything. Then they get back on the bus and they go home. And that is their experience with the natural world, which I'm sure is better than nothing. But it's really been an experience with 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If they have some part of nature right where they live, all they have to do is go outside and become friends with it. Study it, get to know it, fall in love with it, alone, no parental supervision. Let them work it out on their own. When we hover over our kids, we're sending the message that this is dangerous stuff. This is something you should fear. And that is reinforced by the media every single day. That's a terrible message to send our kids who are the future stewards of the planet. If they're afraid of stewarding, if they don't love stewarding, if they don't take it seriously, they're going to be lousy stewards. And we can't afford any more lousy stewardship. And maybe they'll learn how to hunt lizards. I'm learning this from my own granddaughter, Zoe, who lives in a very modest patch of nature in Hawaii. It's a little piece of grass with a hedge, but there are anole lizards there. And when she discovered that, she sent me this picture to describe how you hunt lizards. You get on the ground and you cover yourself with leaves and sticks so the lizards can't see you coming. Then you crawl very slowly toward the lizard. No smiling. This is serious business. You can wear your best dress. That's okay. But you sneak up on the lizard. You catch the lizard. You put it in an aquarium. You learn how to take care of the lizard. You fall in love with the lizard. I don't think Zoe's going to be crawling on the ground in her best dress catching lizards the rest of her life. I don't think. She sent me this picture not too long ago, so who knows? But I guarantee she's going to remember catching lizards in Hawaii the rest of her life. And I guarantee she's going to be a good steward of the planet because of that experience. If you want your kids to do more than catch lizards, get Nancy Strinisty's Nature Play at Home. Dozens of examples of how to expose kids to the natural world. And if you want to join Homegrown National Park, you can do it now. Go to homegrownnationalpark.org. We have a small nonprofit. Register your property. It's free, by the way. You get yourself on the map by putting your location and the amount of area you're going to be a good steward of. Maybe you really are going to cut your lawn in half or reduce it by any amount. Maybe you're going to plant an oak tree. Maybe you're going to put an aster in a flower pot. Whatever you do that falls into the category of good earth stewardship, that area goes on the map and your little piece of your county is going to light up. And you'll get to see everybody else in your county who's joined Homegrown National Park. The object is to get the message that we are all responsible for the future of conservation. We want that message to go viral so that everybody, not just the choir, but everybody gets on board with lighting up the entire country. What are we asking? We are asking people to reduce the area in lawn. Lawn is not contributing anything to our goals. We want to plant more natives in our yards. We want to remove the invasive plants that are already there. Most people do have invasive plants on their properties. And if you own any natural area that you're protecting, you want to continue to do that. Our ecological products are a significant increase in biodiversity. And what's happened at my house shows that it does happen. And it happens pretty quickly. And a measurable reduction in invasive species. Remember, 85% of the country east of the Mississippi is privately owned. If we all remove the invasive plants from our private property, we'd be 85% done. Putting in these removing lawn and putting in lawns that actually do sequester carbon is going to cause a significant drawdown of atmospheric CO2. We will help fight climate change. And we're starting to create viable habitat outside of parks and preserves. Right now, outside of parks and preserves is no man's land for so many species. So we're gonna fix that, and that will connect ecologically those parks and preserves to make biological corridors. There's a sociological product as well, national awareness, not just of what the problem is, but what the solutions are. We're trying to change the culture. Right now, we've got an adversarial relationship with the natural world. We want to change that to a collaborative relationship. We want people to recognize that nature is not optional. Everybody owns responsibility to sustaining it. It converts hope into action. We've been talking about this a long time. It's time to take action, and there are many things that each person can do right where they live. And finally, it's going to merge national conservation efforts, all the things that already exist, Audubon, National Wildlife Federation, Wild Ones, so many organizations doing wonderful things. We're not competing for those members because we don't charge. So you can belong to Audubon and be a member of Homegrown National Park. What we're doing is getting everybody to record their successful conservation on that map so we can see that we're actually doing better than most people think. So we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to join Homegrown National Park. What plants should we put in the areas that we've removed lawn from? I'm going to argue that some of them have to be what I call keystone plants. Remember what a keystone is. It's the stone in the middle of the Roman arch. And when you take that stone out of the arch collapses. Well, when you take keystone plants out of the local food web, the food web collapses because those are the plants making most of the food. Just 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. So think of the keystone plants in the ecological house that you're building as the 2x4s that hold that house up. They are the support system. You cannot build a house out of wallpaper, and that's what we've been trying to do for the last 100 years. You're not through building your house after you get your keystone plants, but it's an essential first step. So the question is no longer simply, are native plants ecologically better than non-natives? On average, they certainly are, but there are a lot of native plants that aren't all that powerful either. So the question really is now, do we want to focus on the most powerful plants, the ones supporting the most pollinators and the most caterpillars, or not? What is supporting the most caterpillars? It's one of our oaks. In the mid-Atlantic states, oaks support 557 species of caterpillars, over 950 species nationwide. There's no other plant genus that comes close to that. And if you want to find out what the best plants are for your county, you go to National Wildlife Federation website, Native Plant Finder, put in your zip code, and the ranked list of both the woody and herbaceous plants that are best for your county will pop up. These are abbreviated lists. I just ran a room here. Let's focus on the herbaceous plants. Goldenrod, native asters, perennial sunflowers. All of them are really good at making caterpillars, but they're also really good at supporting those specialist bees. When you are making a pollinator garden, you want to plant for the specialist bees because the generalist bees will use those plants as well. If you have goldenrods, asters, and sunflowers in your yard, you can support somewhere around 44 species of bees that would not be there if you don't have those plants. So we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in keystone plants. We're going to attract a lot of insects to our yard, and then we're going to kill them with our security light, which of course is not the goal. A lot of research is showing that light pollution is one of the major causes of insect declines nationwide. And these are all the ways that lights are killing our insects, particularly those nocturnal moths that make those caterpillars that run the food webs. But to me, this is good news. We have got to turn around insect declines. We've already lost more than 45% of the insects on the planet, and they are the little things that run the world. If we can turn that around by flicking a switch, we're getting off easy. A lot of switches to flick, but we can do it. But I know what you're thinking. I cannot turn off the light over my barn or over my garage or over my front porch because the bad man will come. Okay, put a motion sensor on your security light so it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you're going to recognize is the bad man doesn't come very often. And if you don't want to do that, take the white bulb out of your security light and put in a yellow bulb, either incandescent or LED. Yellow wavelengths are far less attractive to nocturnal insects. If we switched out our white bulbs for yellow bulbs overnight, we would save millions of insects. And if we use LEDs, millions of dollars too. All right, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in keystone plants. We're going to modify our light system. Then we're going to invite Mosquito Joe to come kill all of our insects. Booming business around the country, mosquito fogging. But mosquito foggers say it's okay because this is a natural product, and it is a natural product. It's pyrethroids, industrial strength pyrethroids, but that's the compound found in chrysanthemums, which evolved to kill anything that eats a chrysanthemum. So it's a natural product, but so is cyanide. So I don't think that makes it okay. They also say it only kills mosquitoes. And boy, I wish that was the case. But in fact, it kills all the insects it comes in contact with. And look, it comes in contact with all the insects, including all the pollinators, including the monarchs. Big monarch killed 2 years ago when they flew through Mosquito Joe, hundreds of dead monarchs on the ground. The interesting thing, the ironic thing is it doesn't control mosquitoes. You don't control mosquitoes in the adult stage. It's too hard. You've got to kill 90% of the adults to do that. Mosquito Joe kills between 10 and 50%, so not even close to being effective. If you really want to control mosquitoes, you do it in the larval stage. And the best approach is biological control through mosquito dunks. Get a bucket, fill it full of water, put in a handful of straw or hay or maybe dead grass and put it out in the sun for a couple of days. You're going to build up the population of algae and diatoms in your bucket. And that becomes an irresistible brew to the local female mosquitoes that want to lay their eggs. They will lay their eggs in your bucket. Then you go to the hardware store and get a sheet of mosquito dunks. This is Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a natural bacterium that only kills aquatic diptera. And the only aquatic diptera in your bucket is mosquito larvae. So, and it's very targeted. If a dragonfly larva gets in there, it won't hurt it a bit. If your dog drinks it, it won't hurt it. You might put a coarse screen over your bucket so your local chipmunk doesn't commit suicide, but targeted, cheap, and if everybody did it, it'd be very effective. But, you know, if you're going to have a party one night and in your backyard, you don't feel like killing anything, get a fan. Turn it on. Makes a directed flow. Mosquitoes don't fly into wind like this. You can comfortably enjoy your yard without killing anything. Okay, the fourth thing we need to do is to landscape in a way that allows caterpillars to complete their development. What do I mean by that? Well, this is just an example, but I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. The caterpillar eats the leaves, then it spins a cocoon and hangs from one of the branches. Then it emerges as an adult, and then it does it all over again. I wish everything did that, but most species don't. Most species finish growing as caterpillars on the tree, then they drop from the tree. They wiggle their way beneath the soil surface, pupate underground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under the tree, and that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree. We don't tolerate it. And we mow and compact the soil under a tree so that it's rock hard, and it makes it very difficult for those caterpillars to get underground to safety, which means the way we landscape in so many situations becomes an ecological trap. If we use the right plants, the moths come in, lay their eggs, caterpillars develop and drop down and die. I am convinced that this is another major cause of insect declines around the country. And of course, the cement landscape is not the answer either. This is what most people do. You got a big tree in a yard. I've got a new grad student that is starting to measure how well caterpillars do in a situation like this, but I guarantee they're going to do better in a situation like this, where you have a tree that maybe you've got a layered landscape, maybe a dogwood, azalea, ferns, ground cover. This is soft landing. The caterpillars fall down. The ground is not compacted. Nobody's going to mow it. Nobody's going to step on them. They can easily get underground and pupate or spin a cocoon in the leaves that are under there. Much higher survivorship. This is where you can do your fancy spring ephemeral gardening. This is how you reduce the lawn, folks. You put a bed around all of your trees, and the bigger, the better. They become all safe sites for those caterpillars. Use your native ground covers liberally, things like wild ginger, native pachysandra. There's a Virginia creeper that's a great ground cover. Golden seal, May apples, foam flower ferns. There's lots of options. If you can see the ground, you don't have enough plants there. Green mulch is the best mulch of all, and it all creates safe sites for your caterpillars. And by the way, your trees will love it. So how do you start? Well, fall is a good time. You rake your leaves into the area you're going to create your new bed. Rake them very thickly and just leave them there. They will smother the grass, and then you plant right through that in the spring. Another former grad student, Desiree Narango, did some wonderful work with chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And her results suggest there's actually room for compromise in our plant choices. She had one simple question: how well do residential landscapes support chickadee populations when they're dominated by native plants versus non-native ornamentals? When they're dominated by non-native ornamentals, they support 75% fewer caterpillars. So right away, you've reduced the amount of bird food by 75%. They're 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. Now, there were nest boxes up in all of her landscapes. So the chickadees would come and they look around and say, well, there's not enough food here. We're not even going to try to breed. If they did try to breed, those nests contained 1.5 fewer eggs. They were 29% less likely to survive at all. If they did survive, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to reach maturity. And if you put all those numbers into a population growth model as a function of the percentage of non-native woody plant biomass in your landscape, from none to 100%, this is what you get. We looked at woody plants because that's where chickadees forage. This is replacement rate. This dotted line is replacement rate. That is the rate at which the population has to make babies to replace the adults that die every year. If you breed at this rate, you have a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you make more babies than adults die, then you have a growing population. And if you make fewer babies, anything down here where you've got a lot of non-native plants, then you have a shrinking, unsustainable population. Now, right here, liberally speaking, is where those lines intersect, which suggests you can have up to 30% of your woody plant biomass non-native in your yard without destroying your local food web. So this is the area of compromise. We can't tolerate any invasive plants here. No calorie pear, no burning bush, because those are ecological tumors. They just escape and castrate the local ecosystem. But there are a lot of ornamental plants that are not invasive. Remember Dan Getman? This is a ginkgo tree. Why does Dan have a ginkgo tree in the middle of his native planting? His wife likes ginkgo trees and asked him to put one in. So he did. Is it destroying the functionality of this landscape? No. Is it going to escape and wreck the local woodlot? No, it's just sitting there. So I tend to think of plants that are just sitting there as they're kind of like statues. So there's Dan's statue. If everything was a statue, Dan would not have a functional landscape, but it's not. It's not the presence of non-native plants that destroys food webs. It's the absence of those native plants that are doing most of the work, those keystone plants. If we increase the percentage of those, we can tolerate non-natives as well. Can we use native plants formally? Of course we can. This is a Lynn O'Shaughnessy design taken by a drone 400 feet up. You don't get more formal than that, and every plant in that landscape is a native plant. Formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe every day, but I guess that's okay because they're non-native plants over there. Can we get a pollinator garden into a suburban yard like this without offending anybody? Of course we can. Just put a fence around it. It formalizes it. Tells people that this is intentional. It's not just a bunch of weeds you forgot to mow. It's pretty when it's in bloom. It's meeting the needs of several species of bees. It's not very big, but if everybody did it, it would help a lot. Help what? Help make our pollinators. Why do we need pollinators? Well, you hear all the time you need them because they pollinate a third of our crops. It's actually about a 1/12 of our crops. I don't like that argument because I hear people say, well, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need any pollinators. Forget the crop argument. We need pollinators because they pollinate 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. If we lost our pollinators, we'd lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet. That's not an option. Where do we need pollinators? Everywhere we need plants, which is everywhere. How about this? Drew Latham design, much bigger. Imagine the amount of life supported here versus the amount of life supported here. Seems like a no-brainer. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Yes, they can, and more of them are doing it. Minnesota has been doing it for a while now as a cost-sharing program that encourages homeowners to reduce or replace their lawn with appropriate Minnesota prairie plants. It's very popular. Pennsylvania's got a new program like that. There's an island off of Florida that's paying homeowners to allow burrowing owls to burrow in their front lawn. Burrowing owls are listed species. I think this is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. If you have an endangered species on your property, we're going to pay you to take care of it, to be a good steward of it, rather than fine you if you use your property. Everybody would want an endangered species. Put a bounty on our invasive plants, like calorie pear. That's what St. Louis, Missouri did. Fayetteville, Arkansas. South Carolina's banned them altogether. North Carolina has a bounty on them. Take a calorie pear out, you got a free tree replacement. Public utilities are giving people $100 coupons to plant water-efficient native plants. And of course, the big lawn replacement programs, particularly in California. This is going up now. You get $3 per square foot rebate for every square foot of lawn you remove and replace with xeric plantings. California is getting some rain today, but they don't have a single drop of rain to waste on lawn. And if you want more information on each one of those programs, memorize this. All right, I think we've made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation, and the first one's important. We're starting to think of nature as if it's optional. We like nature. We like to visit it. We like to take pictures of it, like to watch it on television, but it's not essential. Which means when push comes to shove, when resources are in short supply, nature takes a back seat. And that, of course, is all the time. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and there's this wall-sized poster there, which to me epitomizes our society's view of conservation. We want to save nature, save wildlife, so that future generations can enjoy it. That's what Teddy Roosevelt's argument to support the national park system. We want to save these wonderful places because we want future generations to be able to appreciate them. And I get that. Nature's enormously entertaining, but it is much more than that. We need to save nature so that we have future generations. It's a little bit more urgent. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. And we talked about this, but if we restrict conservation just to places where there's not a lot of humans, we're going to fail because those places are too small, too few, and too isolated. David Quammen has a wonderful analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. This is a functional Persian rug. That's not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug. And that's what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. I don't like that language because it suggests there's places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our corporate landscapes, including our roadsides, even including much of our agriculture. So we need to put the plants back, folks. We need to glue our rug back together again, not just to make ecological corridors that allow plants and animals to move back and forth between viable habitats, but to recreate viable habitats in all the areas we've destroyed them. This is starting to happen. It is happening. And when we get a little farther along, it'll be the first time in modern history that humans and nature actually do coexist. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists, a few conservation biologists, a few ecologists. For some reason, we did not see it as an inherent responsibility of everybody on the planet. But I don't know why, because every single person on the planet depends entirely on the quality of their local ecosystem. So why wouldn't everybody have the responsibility of taking care of those ecosystems? Stan Rushworth, a Cherokee elder, once said, the Western settler mindset was, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You were not born with those mindsets, you're taught them. We've been very good at teaching this one. We've been terrible at teaching our kids and our peers that we all have obligations to good Earth stewardship. That doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. You know, more and more people recognize now that the Earth is in trouble. The Earth has a lot of serious problems, but they all feel powerless. What can one person do? Well, one person can shrink the lawn, one person can use keystone plants, one person can put in a pollinator garden, one person can fire Mosquito Joe, one person can modify their light system. Lots of things one person can do to totally revitalize the little ecosystem on their property and then enhance their greater local ecosystem rather than continue to degrade it. And it also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think of the entire planet's problems. You get depressed. Just worry about the piece of the planet that you can influence. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy, help a park or preserve. They're all underfunded. They're all understaffed. They will love you as a volunteer. So as a property owner or a volunteer, each one of us has the power, and we certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate and then ultimately our own fate. I think I've convinced my grandkids that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks very much.
Hi, everybody. Hello, Doug. Thank you so much for coming to Westport. If anybody has questions for Dr. Tallamy, if you could come over here to the microphone, we have time for a few questions. We have audience coming. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was incredible, and I know a few of us have had the opportunity to hear you speak, and it's always unbelievable. Thank you. So our town just last week passed an ordinance to regulate the use of two-stroke engine gas-powered leaf blowers.
Wonderful.
Yeah, so it's exciting, but of course, by the time the ordinance reached a point where the RTM would approve it, it got watered down pretty significantly. But I just wondered if in your travels, you're seeing more communities do that. And I know California is going to ban the sale of those gas-powered leaf blowers, I think this next year. What are your thoughts about that? And if you could talk a little bit about how they impact the insects.
Yes, I am seeing this. Not just that, but lots of things. Townships are taking action because they're realizing that these issues are important to the people that live in the town. Remember, a lot of our officials, our mayors, they're elected. They want to do what the people want. So we have to make our wishes known. As far as leaf blowers go, removing the leaves is not a good idea. Now we can't, remember you're gonna reduce the area of lawn, but you want to get the leaves off the area of lawn you keep. You want that to be manicured to fit in with the local culture. But we're gonna have less lawn, and we have to move those leaves off the lawn we keep to the areas where we're going to keep them. A picture I showed you of creating new beds with leaves, that's the way to go. And then you can add your leaves to those beds every single year and plant right through those beds. My son bought a new house a few years ago, and the first fall he called me up and he said, Dad, I've got too many leaves. What should I do with them? I said, put them in your flower beds. He said, I don't have enough flower beds. I said, exactly. That's how you shrink the lawn. You create additional flower beds. You get more plants into your yard, and that's where your leaves go. And of course, raking is a wonderful way to do it. It's quiet, doesn't disturb everybody.
Great, thank you.
Hello. I've been thinking of planting some oak trees, and I have a very small lot. It's less than 1/5 of an acre. And I was wondering what species you would recommend for that situation.
Orchis praenoides, or chestnut oak. It makes acorns when it's 5 feet tall.
Oh, okay.
That would be your very best bet.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you could touch a bit on climate change. I mean, we're seeing where we are, we actually have been bumped up a zone. And I'm sure that all of this impacts also the insects. I mean, goldenrod will, grow everywhere, and oak grow everywhere, almost. But how much we as gardeners need to pay attention to that? Because it seems we are behind the 8 ball. And are we trying to catch up? We see now species that live further south coming into our yards. So it's a little bit of a conundrum.
Yeah, good question. And when that happens naturally, that's great. We go with that flow. But climate change is really increasing climate variability. And what happened, 2-3 weeks ago is a perfect example. How cold did it get in your yard then? We still have polar vortices, we have bomb cyclones, we have these cold snaps because the jet stream is highly variable and it drops down on a regular basis. Every year we get these really cold snaps. Remember 2 years ago, the freeze that went all the way down right through Texas into Mexico. If we start moving plants substantially north from their current zone, they're going to die in those cold outbreaks. And also, if we move them far enough north, we're moving them away from the things that use them. And then they're not functioning like native plants anymore. So I'm not a big fan of assisted migration. As things move up naturally, great. But I don't think we should help it. I think what's going to help our plants the most is genetic variability in our plant populations. So we want to encourage as much genetic variability as possible so that they can adapt to these very strong changes. It's my primary concern with cultivars because they are propagated clonally. They have zero genetic variability. So that's my take on it. Everybody doesn't agree with that. Some people think we should be moving plants up north.
Hi there. I have questions about you and basically your career, because you're fascinating to listen to. I didn't know about you, and I'm happy to have heard you today. First complimenting you on your style. It's very kind and easy and quick and so unargumentative, and we're so used to conflict now that it's genuinely a relief to hear somebody just speak about facts in a matter-of-fact way. Do you teach full-time, or have you seen an increase in your graduate students go into this field? Are you encouraged that the field itself seems to be expanding beyond your group when you were a young student?
Well, thanks very much. I hate conflict. I certainly am not going to seek it out. It's interesting you bring that up. I actually started out in dental school because I was too afraid to talk in front of people. So proves people can change. The interest in this, yes, is increasing with students, with the public. We recognize that we've got serious issues, that there's something we can do about it, and a lot of people want to get on board. So I get requests, can I come be your grad student? I don't know, once every 2 or 3 weeks. Problem is the resources to support graduate study in this have not increased at all. For me to support a grad student costs $30,000 a year, and I've got to bring in that money. So that's the big constraint there. But students are interested. I'm in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology. We now have about 140 majors. It's the most we've ever had since I joined the university in the 80s. I think that's your question. We are moving in the right direction. And there's some I've trained some very good students that are going to take over when I retire, which isn't that far away.
Well, quick follow-up then. Are you going to retire on a broader stage? Do you do TED Talks? Are you out there in a big way?
I'm out there a lot. To do a TED Talk, you have to be invited. People have nominated me, I think 3 times, and it's been turned down each time. So no TED Talks yet.
Not fair. No.
But, I do these webinars and I do public talks all the time. So
Okay.
I've got a couple of people working on documentaries.
Good. Keep it up.
Out there, I'm gonna collapse.
Keep it up, and thank you very much for all your effort.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tallamy, for everything you do. Quick question, I hope. Is there anything you can say, sort of a bon mot or something that we can pass along to people we speak to about the genetic variability you talked about and how growing from seed as opposed to vegetative reproduction could be very essential in that? Thank you.
Yeah, that is how you maintain genetic variability. You grow from seed. Those plants have reproduced through sexual reproduction, not through vegetative cloning. So, yep, you've hit the nail on the head. That's how you increase that. We're really talking about protecting natural areas where the populations of plants in those areas have established on their own. So they have met the soil requirements, the environmental requirements. It's worked in the past. Problem now, of course, is that we're changing them rapidly. So some of them are going to hang on. Nature is extremely resilient. It really is. I have confidence that we're going to get through this. We've got to get a handle on it. We've got to control climate change. We've got to stop pretending that we can exist on this planet without the natural world. But we're doing that. So I'm actually optimistic.
Great. We have time for one more question.
It's my lucky day. You mentioned the keystone plants, that some are a lot more productive than others. And in one of the slides, you had a list of trees and a list of plants on the other. Were those the keystone plants? or is there somewhere to find that?
Yeah, well, that was a slide representing what you're going to find on the Native Plant Finder at the National Wildlife Federation website. And they're ranked, so it will tell you how many species of caterpillars each one of those plant genera are supporting in your county. And it's, you know, the highest number is the best keystone plant. But if you look at all the plants in your county, it's about the top 14% that are doing most of the work. But yes, you get that information on that website, Native Plant Finder.
Will you borrow his book in the back? It's got all the lists.
I want to thank you again for coming, and it was a wonderful talk. I think that you have enlightened us and empowered us. And for that, I am grateful, and I'm sure everyone in our audience is. And we look forward to watching the next thing you're doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.